Welcome to the Radical Traceability panel, where over the next 45 minutes, we'll try to uncover how this group of radicals is rewiring the food and fiber value chain. Transparency is one of those concepts that at first it seems crystal clear, but actually it's really all about the gradients and the nuance. It's wrapped up in being accountable of your decisions and actions and outcomes, especially in this environment where there's a growing demand for ESG reporting and evidence of our sustainable outcomes. But it's not a simple matter for any one business to navigate this complicated landscape, especially when information is both powerful and profitable. Transparency can become a massive disruptor. So let's just jump in. Martin, how does radical transparency look like to you from the perspective of a retailer where you have all these contradictory needs from across the supply chain?
I think from my retail perspective, there's two major considerations. I think, first of all, transparency isn't the end, it's the means to the end. And I think we'll all have different perspectives here, but the one thing that unites us is that we all have a business strategy, and transparency has to play a significant role in delivering that business strategy. And then you touched upon another factor which would be front of mind for me when it comes to transparency, which is the plurality of stakeholders that we would have from a retailer perspective. Our customers, what our customers expect to see with regards to transparency, our investors, what our investors want to see in terms of ESG and plans to reduce our emissions, what activists want to see from Coles, and what we've seen increasingly is that activist narrative taking place through the prism of supermarkets over recent times. So what we've got to do is make sure that we understand what transparency means to all of our stakeholders and trying to find that balance. But that balance isn't easy because often those expectations are contradictory, and there's an asymmetry of information that exists across our stakeholders, which means transparency has got to be approached with caution. I think the one thing that I would finally say is you can't go backwards from transparency. So you've got to be sure that when you go on that transparency journey, you understand that it is a journey, that you may not have all of the answers immediately, but you're going to journey over time of increased transparency. Because if you go backwards, then ultimately that is a surefire way of losing trust. And what we all desire to achieve out of this focus on transparency is increasing trust.
Danielle, is transparency the same as traceability? What do you think is driving this effort?
I think traceability and transparency enable each other. So traceability is the conduit for transparency. So we need to be transparent about our information that we're sharing with the customer and what the customer is actually requesting. And traceability is the conduit, pretty much, that actually delivers that information. So for us, it's going to be a completely different story for what Coles are delivering as well. So we're in fibre traceability, if no one knew. Actually, I want to break protocol because I'm super interested to know who's actually in this room. Sorry, my ADHD just went somewhere. But can I just have a show of hands, and who's a producer in the room? Who is a farmer or a producer in the room? Who is in the supply chain and logistics space? And who's in retail and branding? Okay, interesting. Because I say that because I think that it's really important that it's actually a collective effort. And we all have to work together to be able to create transparent information. And when we deliver that transparent information, like you say, there's no going back. Because now we have to answer to greenwashing rules. We have to answer, 8 years ago when we started this, it was a nice to have to understand where our fibre went. Now there's a bigger picture to play, and that traceability project is a journey, but it is also a journey that is narrated by the actual industry that you're in. It's not a blanket throw approach.
Jackie, did you want to add?
Well, I mean, building on that, I think our understanding of traceability and transparency have really radically changed in maybe the last 2 or 3 years even. Because as you very well know, the E of the ESG has always been first and foremost in many people's minds. But now you cannot get away without the S, without the social impact. So talking with large investors, pension funds and others, they're no longer happy with just being able to say, well, we can trace it back to the field. they're going to really want to know about the social conditions that got the product to that shelf in the supermarket. And I think that's where it becomes really difficult, because you can't be radical when it comes to social aspects. You know, there has to be a just transition, there has to be prosperity, and so on. So I think the challenge that I see is, how can we put prosperity of rural communities, prosperity of those who are producing the various things that we buy, at the core, and feel confident that what we're reading about a product is somehow leading to that prosperity? Because at the end of the day, if we don't have farmers who are actually out there actively being profitable and having resilient businesses, well, there'll be no products on the shelves. It's as simple as that. So I think I'm still juggling with the issue of a lot of data about the environment, being able to track that and trace it and so on, really critical to build trust. And then the slightly more difficult piece now, which is around how much do we really think about the farmer welfare, the mental side, what's that traceability, what's that transparency, all the way through. So I think that's where I'm still sitting on the fence. Have we actually arrived at that bit of the social part is for me the big question.
And James, from the end of the supply chain to the consumer, how much information is needed versus how much is wanted, and when does it become too much and we don't even know what we're looking at anymore?
Yeah, good question. I suppose from our platform perspective, we are in that sweet spot of connecting a lot of information to the consumer. What we're seeing is sort of someone that's accessing connected packaging via QR code. So the connection point, a lot of the time, or 60% of the time, it's actually substantiating a claim. So it's sort of an extension to what the packaging's already claiming, and so that would be a click through on an organic logo to see a certificate or some sort of verification behind it. And it's sort of, each consumer has a different motivation for seeking out some sort of clarification of what they've got. And from a brand's perspective, it's very difficult to be able to serve all that information. Hence, you know, we sort of assist in that. But they need sort of 8 seconds to be able to navigate exactly to what they want. And typically it's just substantiating a major brand claim. So whether you're swinging from this is from here or this is organic, and then they want to substantiate that.
When those claims are changing, what's organic and what's ethical, how do we know what that means, and how are you navigating the transparency as the rules are changing and the requirements are changing?
I think all you can do is just keep the dialogue open and very transparent and not try and hide anything. I think when it comes to something like carbon neutral meat, as an example, and there was a conversation in this room earlier about carbon neutral prawns, there's a huge amount of suspicion around what that actually means and whether a product can be carbon neutral. The only way that you can navigate that conversation is by being clear as to what you've done and by working with reputable partners. And so making sure that you go with the gold standard of accreditation, making sure that you're very clear and transparent on the process that you followed is the only thing that you can do. And unfortunately, we live in a world at the moment from a supermarket's perspective where there is probably a deficit of trust. And therefore, it is important that we do work with those partners who are creditable, seen as creditable in the eyes of the customer, because they can bring that and impart that with us. I just wanted to touch upon something that Jackie said around the S element and the social bit. I think that's a really, really important point. And there's two things from my perspective is we've got to find ways in which traceability and transparency have got multiple use cases from the same process. So it's not a case of putting an administrative burden on a producer, on a supplier for a particular process and then replicating that. I think where we can look at things like biosecurity controls and use that also as a lever for traceability helps fractionalize that cost of traceability across multiple use cases. And we've got to use things like change the narrative on things like emission reduction to one where emissions are seen as waste, and being lower waste means being lower cost. And that's certainly something that we've taken to heart with regards to how we work with our producers.
And yeah, I was just going to add to that. So for fibre, for instance, not necessarily is an organic fibre going to be better. The only way that we can determine that is by measuring how we actually grow that fibre. So there's a misconception out there in the world, so we become an education piece as well. So transparency is a massive education piece for the consumer to actually be able to determine whether they are buying something that is actually better for the planet, or it was grown better, or it was under the correct regulations on how that garment was produced. So I think that the more that we can be transparent about our fibre, about our data, about our measurement, we can actually create a very strong narrative for what we're buying and be educated as consumers. And that's what we've been trying to do in our fibre integrity company and also with Good Earth Cotton.
Martin, you mentioned being transparent and using the gold standard and technology, but Danielle, with FibreTrace, you've created a new technology. How did you see this kind of disrupting transparency or traceability when it's not the rule, it's not the gold standard?
I must say, some days I go, why did I do this? I probably once or twice a week. It was something that was born from sheer frustration. There were two frustrations. There was one, I was sick of hearing that cotton fibre was detrimental to the earth. Two, I was incredibly frustrated that I couldn't bring my fibre back in to be able to create my own garments, to have a marketing differentiated product. So that was something that evolved down the track to being a traceability story, to everyone saying, everyone stop, what are we actually tracing? What is the story? And traceability really is about storytelling, and it's about good storytelling. And so if we can change that narrative through that great storytelling, and we can actually now, through the downforce technology, we can actually provide numbers. So we can actually measure everything that we're doing. So, there's an old saying, you can't measure, you can't manage what you can't measure. So we can actually measure all of that, and we can actually stand by our word with real fibre integrity and honesty in what we're saying. So I think the other part of the conversation is, and everyone's got a different industry that we're trying to have a transparent story around, but the fibre industry or the cotton industry has so many hands that fibre passes through, and then once it gets to the spinning mill or the weaving, there are so many different blends of fibres that actually come into that one mill. And I liken it to what we're putting into our fibre is like an air tag at LAX airport. There's so many Samsonite suitcases, I don't know how many times, I know my husband does it all the time, picks up the wrong suitcase all the time that's not ours. So that happens over and over and over in a mill. So how do we actually know what is going into our garments? At the end of the day, we don't, unless we have a physical tracer connected to into a blockchain or to a digital tracer as well. So I think for us, that's a really important aspect for the fibre industry moving forward, and particularly the Australian fibre moving forward, so we can differentiate ourselves in the market.
One of our favorite sayings is you don't grow ketchup on a plant. You have to actually make it. So I suppose, James, with an origin perspective, how does a consumer choose which ketchup they're going to buy based on...
Oh, okay. I thought you were going to go with how do you sort of track multiple
as
inputs.
well as...
Yes. Well, I think from a brand's perspective, it's beginning that story with your champion, right? Tomatoes in the ketchup and not everything. And again, to the echo the saying of, traceability is a journey for us. We started building it as a beef brand and have been on a journey for many years now. So I think to your question from how do you do it, it's really what is the core ingredient that's the hero, and then sort of starting with that and not trying to do too much. I think, I'll put my hand up as a beef brand, we tried to do end-to-end traceability, serialised units. Martin's just, having a nightmare over there because it was hard. And to what outcome? And I think, we probably now, my advice to brands is just start with an element of transparency. Again, there is two terms there, and being transparent about what you're doing and then evolving into traceability. On-pack traceability is difficult, and it's not new. Traceability is not new in that everyone had to recall their products, for the last 30 years. But on-pack traceability is difficult, and there's a cost.
And how is this being translated to the producers who are at the core making the decisions that benefits and outcomes are being translated through the supply chain?
Well, I think if we focus on transparency now,
Yep.
from a producer point of view, where you're going in a sort of global setting is no different than how you'd run your bank account, actually, because what you're looking at is the cost of things coming in and the cost of things going out. Only now we're adding all those other elements, you know, the water, air quality, emissions, biodiversity, and so on. So all these different regulatory financial disclosures that are coming down the line, they are, in a sense, playing to the strength of what a good producer will do, which is to know exactly their cost base, know exactly what they're getting out, and literally what is the legacy that they've got to make up all the time, and where does their profit lie. So I always liken, you know, traceability, transparency to making sure that your books can be looked at. Now, who's going to look at them? Well, of course, you're going to look at them. Your bank's going to look at them. But now we've got other people scrutinizing, natural capital specialists, financial disclosure specialists, and so on. And so what I'm always thinking about is how can we make sure that the numbers that people are generating at the source can literally be carried through like a red thread, collect the data once, use it many times. So you don't keep sort of slightly changing it. And I think that's where the world is going now, where there's much more coherence about these reporting and disclosure requirements, so that literally you can trace, but also be transparent about where numbers have come from, and they can actually stand a lot of scrutiny. Because whether we like it or not, there are some very savvy consumers out there and very savvy non-governmental organizations, civil society, who really do want to know, you know, how much water does it take to grow cotton? How much, you know, air quality, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's where we've got to, putting really emphasis on having an open book approach and not feeling that you need to hide things. And of course, we live in this world where things don't go right every year. So again, living with the sort of fluctuations in the natural world and making sure that the public is understanding, I think that's the big education piece which we all have to face, from the producer right the way through to the retail, to the consumer as well.
I think that's where organisations like Coles have to play a role.
Absolutely.
Because if you've got a producer that is producing and supplying to Coles, they are likely to be supplying into Woolworths, into JBS, into Tees, into whoever else. And what we can't do is have 4 different data definitions, 4 different forms of data capture. So organisations like Coles need to work collectively with industry to say one data definition, one version of data capture, find ways to anonymise how we store and how we utilise that data, because then it becomes an asset, which is understanding your yourself as a producer, understanding what makes you a good producer, understanding opportunities to be better. So I think that's a great point.
Danielle, did you want
Yeah, no, and the data it's critical for us as fibre producers as well, because we forward sell. We're selling a commodity and we're forward selling. So we need to understand, we're engaging with brands for the 2027 season. So we need to understand the requirements of what they require in terms of the digital product passport that's coming in 2027 as well. So we need to have all of that data in a bundle sitting inside of our fibre, and we need to be able to transfer that knowledge. Now, we can't transfer that knowledge in a forward sell if we don't understand it in the growth phase. So I think it's really important that we understand what's happening every day in our fields, or every 10 square metres, every 10 days, and we can actually project where we can go with our hedging positions, with our currency, everything that sits in amongst what we do in day-to-day life. Now, my experience over the years with talking to brands don't even know that. They've never engaged with a grower. They don't know how to get closer to Tier 4, which is the producer. So for us to be able to, not just educate the consumer through this, we have to also educate the brand and the retailer through this position as well. So data will be everything, because they'll look at the bottom right-hand corner at the end of the day. They'll look at, people in risk and compliance. That's all they look at every day. So, you're not just talking to the person in sourcing. It needs to go through the chain of events on what occurs within a brand. So everyone's back of house really needs to be very transparent and open.
So whose responsibility is it, do you think, to make the backs of all of your houses work together?
It's everyone's responsibility. I think it's the consumer's responsibility as much as it's the retailer or the brand, right through to the supply chain, right through to the grower. But the first domino for us, I'll talk just for us, but the first domino to fall is us as Tier 4. So if we can embed as much information into that first domino that falls and pass that through the supply chain, it becomes frictionless. So for us, we've had to make that business as seamless as possible to be able to go through and be accepted into the brand and for them to be able to adopt our technology. And it's a physical product, so the brand has to pay. So you need to be able to provide a service. So I know Martin doesn't want to pay. You're not buying my clothes, that's fine. So it's an interesting situation of everything that's in the back of the house that needs to fall in place.
And who does end up paying for it?
Well, I think it relies on the brand. The brand pays, and they extract either. There's debate if a premium can be obtained. Of the side from our research, it can't, but a switch can occur so they can achieve market share. So I think the brand pays, and then it's down to solution providers to make it as efficient as possible to collect the information and not, because the biggest cost is the production loss in terms of slowing up that production. We were marched out of the abattoirs for slowing up production, attempting to trace these units. So I think the brand pays, and the brand has the biggest opportunity to win, being the market and attaching their brand around something that's greater. And then, the debate would be that producers are held to a higher account and then have to collect more information, which I think that's just what's going to happen. I think, not to speak as an expert from the EU, but they're collecting a lot more information than us now, and we're probably going to be falling behind their initiatives as well. So.
I think something we've touched upon a couple of times is this notion that sustainability and traceability is a journey. And I think the challenge that we touched upon here is that if it adds cost complexity, it makes that journey a lot longer and a lot harder. And I think James touched upon being too ambitious early on with traceability. And something that we tried relatively recently is how we trace using camera technology, a carcass through primary, through secondary processing into our stores. And we would have had to make such significant compromises with regards to the pace and the efficiency of our operations that it adds a level of cost, which means it's not a viable solution, and therefore no one wants to pay for it. So I think the answer is always ways in which that traceability, sustainability element does not add cost complexity and deviate from ultimately what you're trying to achieve.
And I think it can. I think, that's technology is the answer to that. Is it there? And probably the most complicated supply chain being tracing red meat through, from carcass all the way through. But it will get there, and if that can be achieved, I think some of your core inputs around vegetables, etc., become a lot simpler to trace those and have little, if any, input in a way that you reduce the efficiency of production. Because as soon as that happens, then no one wants to partake. So I think we're close, but still, it's the willingness of brands to want to trace, and they're doing it because they're looking at an opportunity in market to market from. I don't know, Martin's got the figures on it, not to put you on the spot to give it to us, Martin, but around surveying the percentage of consumers that are willing to want a traceable product, and I think to Martin's point, it's probably lower, but I believe that subset is where the progressive brands are going after, and that's an emerging space of those consumers that are very concerned. And when the progressive brand hits that 10% or whatever the number is, which it is a lower base that's looking for this, they then build brand from that, and then that 10 becomes 20%, and then people are now buying brand. And I think we did have some Tony's Chocolonely last night, didn't we, Nina? In terms of, it's a perfect example of how a brand can swing from it and then ultimately win.
How are you seeing this, Jackie?
Well, I just wanted to introduce a different commodity, if I can, for a moment. So Kenya tea. I don't know if any of you grew up with sort of basically drinking. In the UK, we'd had Brook Bond, Thai food. And the one thing about tea, up until more recently, is you expected your tea to taste a certain way, and it had to taste the same. Back in the tea plantations, though, every morning it meant that there were rafts of people sipping tea from all the different sort of cartloads that were coming in, because they had to get the blend so that it always tasted the same, literally from all these different tea plantations. Today, facing a declining market, competing with coffee, where people are really quite precise about the kind of coffees they like, tea has sort of suddenly woken up. And so we've been talking literally to them about what does that look like. So on price, if you don't get your tea into the drying factory within 6 hours, the price just drops, from 90 to 30 shillings a kilo. Huge differentiation. However, what's happening now is that there's a consumer market awakening in the face of it, saying, actually, we can discriminate through our taste from tea from this region, from that region, from this field, from that field. So the Kenya Tea Development Agency has suddenly realized that they're no longer going to be in a big kind of commodity block, and they're going to have to differentiate. And so, yes, I think what's going to happen is more and more, we're going to go back to the fact that consumers are much more discriminatory. And I would hope that one day, we would have, maybe it's your invention, I don't know, a way to, so I love the idea that the product is carrying its own message, that actually it's got something embedded in it. So a tomato, with its nutrient density, we should be able to know, literally, as that tomato arrives in the marketplace, pretty much everything about it, and not literally have to rely on someone else telling us. Mm-hmm. That's where I can see this future. So I think some commodities are waking up to this differentiation, and they're going to reach out to traceability, to blockchain and all the others. But ultimately, if we don't produce the product in the quality that's required, then it will just go downhill. And that is what's happening in the tea industry. So it has to sort of wake up and realize that differentiation. It's not a price premium. This is a survival. This is literally going to be survival.
So what do you guys see as the kind of game-changing technologies that have come out recently that have shifted this discussion in your practices in business with respect to transparency or traceability?
Oh, look, I to be honest, I'm not seeing like a huge. I just think there's more application of IoT and the ability to collect information. I don't think it's just there's more people adopting it. Yes, AI and things, but not that that's massively playing a role in what we're doing yet. It will, but I just think there's more people that are using the remote sensors to collect information. And once you remove that need for a human interaction, then people are more willing to sort of participate. So yeah, to answer your question, I'm not seeing new tech, like we use blockchain. I think that's old news. So I think that's just part of our tech stack. It is what it is. It provides an element of transparency and the ability to validate. But beyond that, it's a part of what we do.
I think what we've seen recently is the democratization of data and access to data, and that has been a game changer, and we're just on that start of that journey. And it's exactly what Jackie said with regard to the data that exists around product. If you want to do your own comparison of products available at Coles and Woolworths, there's very smart people who can write a script for you and scrape that information for you every single day. It's there in the public domain. It's perfectly available, and I think that means that the need for transparency is increasing, and it's not going to go away. And not that big retailers like Coles would ever want to hide things, but now it is not possible to do that because the data is out there in the public domain, and it's so accessible. And retailers like Coles have got to adapt to that.
I would like to say one thing here, though, because the European Union, I mean, it's not the big baddie that everyone seems to think sometimes, but they do follow regulations that come from public demand. And one of them is about the use of different kind of pesticides, chemicals, and so on. So what I think is missing quite often is that readily accessible truth test, which is actually, we may not be organic, but we're not using residue, we're not using pesticides and chemicals. So I think there needs to be sometimes an antidote coming from maybe the research community, but more broadly, that tells people about the wholesomeness and the goodness of what they have, as opposed to thinking that everyone's growing everything in the same way. So the labeling that some of the producers get, like cattle and livestock and so on, and red meat, it really needs to be unpacked, and helping the public to unpack that, whether it's through a clever tracer or some transparency, I think is incredibly important, because yes, legislation is set up, but there are so many myths out there that really the public needs help breaking some of those myths to understanding that actually what you've got on the corner is sometimes really good, and you don't need to read all the hype about it. So I'm looking for innovations in technology that will help the consumer differentiate between the hype that they read and the reality of what they have in their hand in the kind of local stores or the supermarkets.
And that allows the producer to control the narrative. So when you have transparency, call it radical or call it just plain transparency, you are allowing yourself as a producer or as an industry body to control the narrative and control the myth. It's very easy, you're one Google away, you're one ChatGPT away. I use ChatGPT. That's what I say now. I don't Google anything. I use ChatGPT. And once you set your algorithm, if that information is incorrect, you're going to start to believe it. And that's the next generation. That's how they're getting their information. So we need to control that narrative as industries. And when we can do that, we do that through true transparency and true information sharing, and just continue to set the algorithm ourselves.
Just to bring up a bit of a juxtaposition, so Martin, you mentioned the gold standard rules and certification, but then checking down, you brought up that sometimes these certifiers or certifications are quite rigid and they don't tell the whole story or highlight different parts of it. So how does one navigate getting the answer you're after when you're given a symbol? And what is the reward or the risk to any one of you to break the rules and be radical?
I think, look, I sit on here ultimately as a brand marketer. We were a brand. I think the opportunity for brands to educate, and then with the education, build brand and win, right? It's like, and winning, doing something good. So like, there's too many attributes and too many certifications, and so therefore there's an education piece. But I find that with that education, it's not there's your lead consumer that is high conviction seeking out this information, and their voice is the one that then builds the brand. Like if I use, and it's not because you mentioned tomato sauce, but at my table sitting around at a barbecue recently, my wife was talking with another wife around the tomato sauce, and this one was attribute A, B, C. My wife is not a high conviction purchaser that's seeking something out, but next week that sauce is in my fridge. So I think if the education piece happens from someone being transparent, that lead consumer buys it and then brand builds from that, I think is where that's the opportunity.
I think we could learn a lot from waste and recycling, because we invented a sort of 7-symbol process of, it gets more and more clear that you're doing something, we're not quite sure what you're doing. And, I literally spent about 5 years unraveling all of that for plastics, because it became very clear that when they said bioplastic, recyclable, don't really know. And so you find things out in the environment which should have literally dematerialized almost, and they're still there 100 years later, toothbrushes and so on. So I think we've made life so complicated. I see people standing in front of the separation bins going, okay. You need a sort of pictorial guide of everything to figure out which one to put it in, right? So we shouldn't repeat that mistake. We should try to be as clear as we can as an industry to say, what is it that really matters when it comes to buying food? And I mean, I don't know the brand that you're talking about for tomato ketchups.
Beerenberg.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Brand stop here. But it's absolutely clear that at the end of the day, it shouldn't really matter as long as the core ingredients are okay. I mean, you may lose your market share. So I think we need to be far more sensible how many things we expect people to read. And the studies that we have of people when they go into a shop to buy things is that they go in with a list. If things are not in the same place, within 2 seconds, they'll just put their hand to the nearest product. And I'm sure you know about shelf stacking. So there's a whole psychology. So much is spontaneous when you walk into a shop, when you think you've got a plan. So again, as long as we make sure that all products meet some level of the criteria we want, that has to be the first absolute assumption, that everything we're going to have has got some ingredients that we want to see in the thing we're buying. And then after that, yes, okay, the brands take over. Naive, but really important.
Yeah, I wouldn't disagree. I think, and I'd love to sort of have Martin speak to it, but it does come down to what the consumer is asking for. And at the moment, I think there's very limited bandwidth for some of this greater transparency. And you mentioned some surveys that you guys have done, and I think we need to echo that and try and get that information back to the consumer. But whether it's legislation that does that or it's consumer sort of demand, I think it's consumer demand that'll lead it.
I think there's certain elements that certainly would move the dial, but from a customer, ultimately, your product of choice, your retail of choice, other than convenience, is always going to come down to quality and price, and you can't move away from that. But somewhere down that hierarchy, there is a sustainability message that does make you go left or right, and depending on the product, it's further up or down that hierarchy. I think there are certain elements, though, that are the right to do business for someone like Coles, that you don't want to translate into a customer message, you just do because it's the right thing. And I was in this room earlier, and there's Rob van Barneveld from Sunpork, and we work with Sunpork, and the journey of making animal welfare outcomes in piggeries better is not a message that you can communicate to customers. It's a very, very tough message to land. You do it because it's the right thing to do. Mm-hmm. And so finding those brand differentiators, because you want a customer to come to Coles versus a competitor, is absolutely important. But we get out of bed in the morning also to try and do the right things and improve things for future generations. And they are often things that you can't communicate, you just do them because they're the right things. Mm-hmm.
How do I trust any of the information you're telling me? So in the age of ChatGPT, AI, what's going on in the world, there's a lot of information and misinformation. How are we going to be radical and make it transparent so you know what the truth is?
Oh, yeah, long way to go. I think, GS1 and their path to verified documents, I think it needs to sort of sit above brand, and I think that's a journey, and I think they're tackling that, and I think, when you can hit a verified document and someone's empowered to do it, so the brand, your role is to just share the information. At the moment, that could be a fake PDF or whatever you're doing, unless you're linking it back to the certifier's website and they've got some sort of, which some are moving towards that, but you're right, at the moment, but I think it's a progressive space that ultimately the higher standard provider verifies it, a consumer can hit it, look at it, have confidence, and then they will be loyal to that brand, and then away it goes. So they're not going to check it every time, they're just sort of doing a discovery phase, and at that discovery phase is the opportunity.
Yeah, and again, you need to have for fibre and for garments, you have to have a physical tracer sitting in with that physical with the digital blockchain, and to be able to travel that message through. I think that consumer trust is only one part of it. It's also the other part where you do need certification bodies. But how far do you go with a certification body? You can't. Who checks the checker? It's almost that conversation. So who's checking the certification body? We want the godfather of that. We want the ISO standard. So we want to be able to make sure that we have the correct methodology that is sitting around the certification and the correct information that's sitting inside inside the fibre, and that creates the integrity of what you're buying. And then that message, the rest of it is marketing, and the rest of it is a story that you're telling through that conversation. And to be able to make that, to be able to translate that to just layman's terms of what the customer wants to hear. Did it cause any harm along the way? Was it okay for the environment? And will this be able to be recycled? Or will we know if this garment can be recycled? And where is it going to end up when someone's had enough of it after 3 days, which is our new generation? Because we can't wear anything twice.
Misinformation, though, is a absolute significant problem that exists out there at the moment, and we face into it being a very customer-facing brand, and in recent times, challenges around the use of feed additives in beef supply chains have received a huge amount of scrutiny on the basis of misinformation, and I don't think it's something that we've got the answer to yet, but it's something that we're going to have to learn to have the answer to.
Well, I think just exactly what we've said all along. It's the integrity, it's the right thing to do. You just keep doing it, and in every case you don't get it right. But the fact is that you can always show that you're trying to stick to principles. And I think it does come back to the ethics and the morals and such a bigger picture. So I have trust, for example, when I can look in the eyes of someone and I think, yeah, that person is leading this organization or this retailer. But that does mean that literally everyone who works for Coles, I use that as an example, has to, in a sense, be inculcated into that whole thinking. And I really do believe it, and it comes back to the panel this morning about staff and the workforce and so on. It just really has to be in the DNA of everybody that what we're trying to do is to improve literally everything. So it is worth being transparent, respecting whistleblowers and so on. It is worth going to the extra effort of being able to trace things back, because in the end, the whole trust goes up for the whole system. But it is about the staff who work in the whole agri-food system and the supply chain.
And I think on that, I think we're early in that journey, but traceability will be normalised in the next 5 years. It's an expectation. And so at the moment, there's brands that are leading and they're sort of pushing it forward, but I think it's going to level up quite quickly where it's the expectation, the barcode converting to a 2D barcode. With that, I believe the expectation from a consumer would be, I can hit that and I'm entitled to this information. And if a brand's not providing it, it's sort of like, if you're a company and you've got a website and it's just terrible, like from the 1990s, then people aren't going to trust your brand. So if they're going to hit those codes and you're not giving them transparency and traceability and where your carbon sits, et cetera, then they're not going to, and then they're not going to scan every QR code, but they will make a decision. And then my wife and everyone that follows behind that go, well, someone's checked that, right? Because everyone's putting it out there. So I think the journey's early, but it will be 5 years from now. It's not a conversation of like, should we be doing it? I think it's just everyone's has to lift their game.
So is it radical to do no harm and to just tell the truth? Is this what you gang of radicals rewiring the supply chain are telling everyone? Just be good?
Yeah, I think that the radical side to it is, right now it's hard and not everyone's doing it, so they're seen as a challenger, they're taking on something, so it's radical because it's not being normalised, it's not being done. So I think the challenger brands, and that's where we see the exciting opportunities, the ones that are coming in and shaking up a category. I think every category has something in its supply chain that people don't want, and then a brand will come and say, we don't do X, Y, Z, and away they go. So they're the upstarts, that's what's radical about it. 3 years from now, I think, or 5 was my number before, it won't be, it's just normal.
I want to come back to the issue of certification, because unfortunately we have a world filled with many certifiers who have a self-interest in making sure that that certification gets out there. So, who's watching the certification? And I think that's the radical piece. We need people who are out there, in a way, being the intrusive part of the certification process. So inevitably, we're going to have incontrovertible evidence that has maybe a physical evidence that you can trace, which may or may not fit a particular certification scheme. So ISO is sort of floating here because all the national bodies have to be part of that. So you need to be consistently going upwards and having independent viewers take the criticism, improve. So I'm always rather leery of certifications that actually self-justify. So great to get membership and great to get some indication of a mark of what you're doing, but at the end of the day, it's got to be completely independently and scrutinized in that way. So that for me is one of the reasons why we need much more global agreement on how and what will be those standards rather than certificates.
Which I don't know where that goes in terms of globally very hard, I think, but from the EU's perspective, they're the ones that are setting the standard for everyone else to follow, and with Danielle's work in the digital product passport is just huge, right? So I think we will all follow suit in some way from that.
Yeah. Well, I think we have to as exporters. I mean, we're an export country. We don't have any manufacturing here, so they are our customers. So we have to be radical in the way in which we approach our export market, and we need to implement everything that we're doing. So we need to change our ways. We need to change the way in which we think as industry bodies. We need to embrace the new technologies, what the new generation wants, what they expect, and then we need to just follow suit. We don't have an option. It's as simple as that. Call it radical if you like, but it's a new way of life.
And I think we might just leave it with being radically simple going forward. Thanks, all of you.